The life of Richard Langston was the epitome of wealth, influence, and prestige. As the CEO of Langston Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with interests spanning from aviation to luxury real estate, Richard was accustomed to getting what he wanted. At 58, he was still a commanding figure, sharp, shrewd, and ruthless in both business and personal affairs. But it wasn't his fortune or power that would seal his fate. It was his insatiable desire for control, a desire that would lead to his downfall. Enter Emily Parker, the 24-year-old daughter of Richard's private pilot, Jack Parker. Emily was everything Richard was not: young, vibrant, and untouched by the darkness that came with his world. She had just graduated with a degree in art history and was full of dreams, hoping to carve out a path of her own. Her father, Jack, a retired Air Force pilot, had been with Richard for over a decade, and their families had a cordial, albeit distant, relationship. Emily had always admired Richard from afar, fascinated by his charisma and commanding presence. When Richard noticed Emily at a company event celebrating her father's service, something shifted. She was no longer the little girl he'd seen on family outings. She was a stunning young woman, confident yet innocent, with a sense of naivety that intrigued him. Richard was used to the company of younger women, but there was something about Emily that was different. It wasn't just her beauty or the fact that she was forbidden. It was the challenge she represented. He knew the dangers of pursuing her, but that only made the pursuit more intoxicating. It began innocently enough. Richard started inviting Emily to his art gallery openings, offering to introduce her to influential people in the art world. Emily, flattered by the attention from a man of Richard's stature, accepted his invitations, eager to build her network. She was oblivious to the undercurrents of his intentions, viewing Richard's interest as nothing more than a mentor's support. As weeks passed, Richard's advances became more pronounced. Private dinners under the guise of business discussions, late-night phone calls that veered into personal territories, and lavish gifts that made Emily uncomfortable but reluctant to refuse. She found herself caught in a whirlwind, unsure of how to navigate the complicated dynamics at play. Her father had warned her about the ruthlessness of men like Richard, but she believed she could handle herself. Then, on a summer evening at Richard's private villa, everything changed. Under the shimmering stars and the influence of too much wine, Richard made his move. He confessed his desire for her, speaking of a connection he couldn't ignore. Emily, though shocked, was not entirely surprised. She had sensed the tension, but had been too naive to fully grasp the implications. Torn between flattery and fear, Emily didn't know how to respond. Richard, sensing her hesitation, pressed on, promising her the world, connections, opportunities, a life she could only dream of. Overwhelmed, Emily gave in. That night marked the beginning of a secret affair that would consume them both. Richard was infatuated, but his obsession was more about possession than love. He showered Emily with gifts, took her on extravagant trips, and made her feel special. But beneath the surface, his controlling nature began to emerge. He monitored her every move, became jealous of her interactions with other men, and grew possessive in ways that frightened her. Emily, trapped in a gilded cage, felt the walls closing in. What had started as an exciting fling had turned into a dangerous entanglement. She knew she had to end it, but Richard's influence loomed large over her life. Every time she tried to break free, he would draw her back in, his charm masking the darkness beneath. The situation grew tenser as the months passed. Emily's father, Jack, began noticing the changes in his daughter. She was more withdrawn, less vibrant, as if something was draining the life out of her. He didn't know the full extent of her relationship with Richard, but he sensed something was very wrong. The breaking point came when Emily discovered she was pregnant. Terrified, she knew this was the final straw. She couldn't bring a child into this twisted situation. She had to escape Richard's grasp, no matter the cost. But what she didn't realize was that Richard, too, had discovered her secret, and he had no intention of letting her go. On the night of November 12, 2021, the storm raging outside was nothing compared to the turmoil brewing inside Richard Langston's mansion. Emily had finally summoned the courage to confront him. She knew it was risky, but she was desperate. Every fiber of her being told her that this was her last chance to escape the grip he had on her life. She had written a letter to her father, explaining everything, and left it hidden in her room, just in case. Emily waited in the dimly lit study, the air thick with tension. Richard arrived shortly after, his expression darkening as he saw her pale, determined face. She wasted no time, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm leaving, Richard. I can't do this anymore. I'm pregnant, and I'm not going to raise a child in this, whatever this is." For a moment, there was silence, a dangerous calm before the storm. Richard's eyes narrowed, and the facade of the charming billionaire fell away, revealing the monster underneath. "You're not leaving, Emily. You belong to me," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "That child is mine, and you're not going anywhere." Emily stepped back, fear gripping her heart as she saw the rage flickering in his eyes. "I will leave. I have to. You can't control me forever." She turned to leave, but Richard was quicker. In 2 swift strides, he blocked her path, his hand wrapping around her arm like a vice. "You think you can just walk away? After everything I've done for you?" His voice was rising, shaking with fury. He shoved her against the wall, the force knocking the air out of her lungs. Emily struggled, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't expected him to become violent, and now she was trapped, panic clawing at her insides. In a moment of sheer desperation, she lashed out, her hand catching the corner of a heavy crystal paperweight on the desk. She swung it at him, aiming for his head. Richard staggered back, momentarily stunned by the blow. It gave her the window she needed, and she bolted for the door, but Richard was a hunter, and she was his prey. He caught her before she could reach the hallway, his hand grabbing a fistful of her hair, yanking her back. She screamed, the sound echoing through the empty mansion, but no one was there to hear her. The struggle was brutal. Richard, in a blind rage, dragged her back into the study, throwing her onto the floor. Emily scrambled to get up, but he was on her, pinning her down, his hand around her throat. She clawed at his arm, gasping for air, her vision blurring as she fought for her life. "Please, Richard," she choked out, tears mixing with the blood from the cut on her forehead. "Don't do this." But Richard was beyond reason. His face was contorted with rage, his grip tightening as he spat venomous words. "You should have known better, Emily. You don't get to walk away from me." And then, in a flash of madness, he reached for the letter opener on the desk, the polished silver gleaming in the dim light. Before Emily could react, he drove it into her chest, the blade sinking in with sickening ease. She gasped, her eyes wide with shock, a silent scream frozen on her lips as the pain overwhelmed her senses. Richard staggered back, his chest heaving as he looked down at her. Blood was pooling beneath her, staining the pristine carpet. She reached out a trembling hand, her eyes pleading, but her strength was fading fast. Richard watched, his mind racing, the reality of what he had just done crashing over him like a tidal wave. Emily's hand fell limp, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as the life drained out of her. Richard stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at the blood-stained letter opener in his hand, then back at Emily's lifeless body, and the enormity of his actions hit him. Panic set in. He had to think, had to get rid of the evidence, had to cover his tracks. He wiped the handle of the letter opener with his sleeve, then shoved it into Emily's hand, pressing her fingers around it, hoping to leave her fingerprints on the weapon. His mind was racing, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He couldn't let anyone find out. Not the police, not the media, and especially not Jack Parker. He would lose everything: his company, his reputation, his freedom. Richard staggered to his feet, his mind spinning as he tried to come up with a plan. But no matter what he did, the truth would always be there, staring him in the face. He had killed her. He stumbled out of the study, his breath coming in gasps as he tried to compose himself. But there was no escaping the reality of what he had done. Emily Parker was dead, and there was no going back. Richard knew he had to act fast. His heart pounded as he moved through the mansion, grabbing cleaning supplies, rags, anything he could find to erase the traces of his crime. He returned to the study, his mind blank as he tried to wipe away the blood splatter on the desk and the floor, but it was useless. The crimson stains were already seeping into the carpet, spreading like an irreversible stain on his life. He thought about what to do with Emily's body. Panic gnawed at him, and his mind raced with half-formed plans. Maybe he could make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but as he stared at her lifeless form, He realized there was no way he could cover this up. The letter opener was still lodged in her chest, and her eyes, those eyes that once looked at him with admiration, were now vacant, staring into the abyss. A new plan formed in his mind. He would call Jack, pretend to have found Emily like this, act as the shocked bystander. It was risky, but he was out of options. His fingers trembled as he dialed Jack's number, his voice frantic as he screamed into the phone. "Jack, it's Richard. Emily's been attacked. She's in my study. Please, come quick." Jack's voice on the other end was filled with panic and confusion. He didn't wait for more details. He hung up and raced to the mansion, his mind reeling. Richard hung up the phone, his breathing ragged. He had to make it look real. He ruffled his hair, scratched his face, even knocked over a vase to make the scene look chaotic. 15 minutes later, Jack arrived, his face pale as he rushed into the mansion. He found Richard kneeling beside Emily's body, fake tears streaming down his face. I don't know what happened, Jack. I found her like this," Richard cried, his voice breaking. "I tried to save her, but it was too late." Jack's world shattered as he looked at his daughter's lifeless body, the blood still pooling around her. He couldn't process what he was seeing, his mind refusing to believe the nightmare before him. "Emily, my God, no," he screamed, his voice raw with anguish. He collapsed beside her, his hands shaking as he touched her cold cheek. The police arrived moments later, alerted by a neighbor who had heard Jack's screams. Detective Sarah Mills, a seasoned investigator, took charge of the scene. She had dealt with high-profile cases before, but this one was different. The victim was the daughter of a respected pilot, the scene gruesome, and the only witness was one of the most powerful men in the city. Richard stuck to his story, playing the part of the devastated friend. He told the police he had heard a noise and found Emily like this. Jack was too distraught to speak, his mind numb with grief. Detective Mills listened carefully, her sharp eyes observing every detail. Something about Richard's demeanor didn't sit right with her. His tears seemed forced, his expressions rehearsed. The forensic team got to work, collecting evidence and photographing the scene. They noted the smudged bloodstains, the haphazard attempts to clean up. It didn't add up. Mills questioned Richard about his whereabouts that evening, and his answers were evasive, inconsistent. He claimed he had been in his room and hadn't heard anything until it was too late. But the evidence told a different story. Emily's blood was found on Richard's shirt, partially wiped away but still visible. The letter opener, still clutched in Emily's hand, had his fingerprints all over it. As the night wore on, the pieces began to fall into place. 2 days later, the forensic analysis revealed the truth. The blood pattern analysis showed that the struggle had occurred between Richard and Emily. The fingerprints on the letter opener, the smears on the floor, and the staged scene all pointed to Richard's guilt. Detective Mills confronted him with the evidence, her voice cold and steady. "Mr. Langston, the evidence doesn't lie. You were the last person to see Emily alive. The fingerprints, the blood stains, they all lead back to you." Richard's facade cracked. He stammered, trying to deny it, but the truth was staring him in the face. Mills pressed on, relentless. "You killed her, didn't you? It wasn't an accident. You were trying to cover it up." Richard finally broke, his head in his hands as he confessed. He told them everything, how he had lost control, how he didn't mean to kill her, but it was too late. His power, his wealth, couldn't save him now. He was arrested, his fall from grace swift and brutal. The trial was swift. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Richard Langston, the billionaire who thought he could have anything he wanted, was convicted of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jack Parker, broken by the loss of his daughter and the betrayal of the man he once trusted, left the city, unable to bear the memories. Emily's death left a void that could never be filled, a tragic reminder of how unchecked power and obsession could destroy lives. The mansion stood empty, a silent testament to the darkness that had unfolded within its walls. And Richard, once a man who held the world in his hands, spent his days in a cell, haunted by the memory of the young woman he had destroyed.